Hello, sociology. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the sociology of groups. This is one aspect of sociology that is really center to it. A sociologist is going to see groups in any gathering of individuals. However, we have to be careful to really define terms on the front end because not all collection of people are necessarily groups. But at the point at which they have some shared meaning or shared identity, well, then they will always be identified as a group by sociologists. So, in aggregate, these are people who are just sharing space, people on the bus. Then you have a category. These are people who share similar characteristics. And finally, a group. These are people who see themselves as belonging and have a sense of shared identity. Cooley talked about primary groups, and he said that primary groups are those oftentimes family units that give us the springs of life. He's called the family the first group because these are essential to our emotional well-being. They tend to be smaller, very personal, can be our true self, and they serve as a mirror within. Your family oftentimes are the first individuals who give you statements about who you are. If a kid is running around the house, the mother says, you're so high strung. And the sociologist would say these kind of statements that get imprinted on a person's identity. And in time, they see themselves as being high strung and start act accordingly. We have many different groups. Secondary groups are those groups, also referred to as social groups, in which people come together on the basis of mutual interest. You're in a sociology class or you're in the band. They're more formal than primary groups, and members are going to interact on the basis of statuses. They fail to meet our basic intimacy needs. So this idea of interacting on the basis of statuses, that just basically means that you can't really see a person outside of that status. You don't know them. One example of this is going to the post office and seeing your principal in shorts. And I've had students who have told me, I didn't know my principal wore shorts. In hindsight, you probably would say, yeah, I'm sure he wears shorts, because you've never seen him. Perhaps you've never seen a principal in a real laid back environment. So secondary groups have a very funny way of developing and morphing, and many times members of a secondary group will break off into primary groups. I'll oftentimes ask my students about their 5 closest connections. These people make up their primary group. And then I ask the follow-up question, how many of these primary group relationships once began just as a very anonymous and random person that you happen to be in band with, or somebody you played sports with, or someone who just lived on the block. And that gives you a picture of how sociologists see that we eventually form primary groups. But there's other groups that we can discuss in sociology. So voluntary associations, these are groups that form on the base of mutual interest. This could be a religious group. This could be a social group at school, the president's council, or a group like Brookhaven Animal Rescue League here in our hometown. This is the kind of a rescue animal agency version of the SPCA. But these are all connections of voluntary groups, and they all work via the inner circle and the iron law of oligarchy, which just basically says there's usually a group of people who make most of the decisions. It's also been referred to as the 80-20 rule. 20% of the people do 80% of the work, and because they're vested in this so much, they oftentimes are very picky about the people that they pass the reins over to. So it's usually the iron law of oligarchy says that a small group of people self-perpetuating elite simply identify people that have similar values, and therefore groups maintain a similar identity over the years. In-groups and out-groups oftentimes ask students about their experience at homecoming, where perhaps you and your friends or you and your school had another rival school that you loved to hate. So if you look at the definition of an in-group, people feel loyalty towards this collection of people, and it is essentially groups that are closely tied in with an identity. It could be key to religion. You have religious in-groups and out-groups, and this is why we have ethnic tension in different communities. You also have out-groups would be the opposite. These are individuals, the group members of a group that we have animus towards, the group of people that our people like to dislike. Now, oftentimes these are not conscious. They're happening sort of in the back of our minds. I think most of my students would say that I consciously dislike a group of people because they come from a different part of town. Oftentimes it's very subtle. And the reason I say this as illustration is that it's relevant, but they say that the two things you don't talk about at work are politics and religion. And the reason is because you can divide very quickly. Republicans and Democrats are oftentimes out-groups. When, my students who are liberal, progressive, Democrat will have attack ads towards their candidate and they are enraged, but an attack ad against the opponent, the Republican, conservative, then those are fine. And if we sort of just take a step back and take a look at the us versus them mentality, I think you will see patterns. Sometimes it can help us think more objectively as we make decisions about who to vote for. Sociologists look at groups like reference groups. These are groups that we use to evaluate ourselves. The reference groups will change as we go through the life course, but essentially these are groups that help us reflect as to who we are, and they show us when values of other groups contradict, and they serve as a point of reference. So a social group or electronic communities. This occurs when people connect online. This could be online communities. This could be Twitter. Twitter, you're really seeing as an electronic community where people will form threads or hashtags based on political beliefs, similar political or religious beliefs. Sometimes these can be impersonal, that you can't really reach out to someone and really communicate your heart in 140, 200 characters or less. So when you look at bureaucracies, this is another type of group. Max Weber said that there's something about them that is inhuman almost. A bureaucracy is a large organization. It could be a government organization. It could be a medical community. Oftentimes these are associated with the social institutions that we talked about in the earlier chapter. So if you look at what the medical community was like here in Mississippi in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, you had doctors who made house calls. Earlier on in our agricultural society, if someone didn't have cash to pay the doctor, they could exchange a baby goat for medical care. At that point, the doctor could then sell the baby goat and could survive and live, and his practice could grow, and did this through bartering. Well, I guarantee you, if you went to the emergency room today and you brought a baby goat, they're not accepting that. Actually, many students will report they don't have insurance, that they feel like second-class citizens, and this is because our medical health care has been bureaucratized, as are all other social institutions. The bureaucracies have clear-cut levels of division, divisions of labor, written rules, written communication and records, and are quite impersonal. These take on a life of their own. So what this means is goal displacement occurs when, over time, the end goal morphs for bureaucracies. And they are well known or synonymous for red tape. Red tape, you probably know this if you fill out an application for financial aid, or if you fill out an application for any other government assistance. There's tons of red tape, just mountains of paperwork, or it could be forms filled out online and submitted that really just make life very challenging. So in terms of group dynamics, we talk about how groups are actually impacted by the number of people. A dyad is a group of 2, a triad is a group of 3. And as group size increases, a few things happen. First, groups become more formal. They also become more stable. You could have coalitions that are formed. So a coalition is when 2 people within a triad gang up on someone else of weaker power. So like you see in a triad of a mom and a dad and a single child, an only child, you will see sometimes mother goes to the child and says, well, you know, your dad's in a bad mood, so let's just keep this secret between us, that you got in trouble. Well, it's actually some form of triangulation, and the mom may feel that she lacks power, and so therefore she may try to include or triangulate one of the children. Perhaps you did this if you ganged up on one sibling with another sibling. Of course, it would require a larger group. Triads are interesting in that they are the first group size that can form coalitions. You can't form a coalition with a dyad. It's just 2 people. And what you find is the group size gets bigger. You have greater diffusion of responsibility. So in a large group, sometimes people will not take care of details because they assume someone else will just take care of it. As a group gets larger, smaller groups may break off and form. Groupthink can also occur, which is a type of collective tunnel vision. So groupthink happens when it's mob rule, where you have a group of people who just get enraged and incensed concerning a social issue. If you take a look at this chart, this is one of my favorite graphs to highlight, because I think what it shows is the vastness of group dynamics. So if you have a dyad, there's only one relationship. This is maybe a single mom and an only child. If they get into a fight in adolescence, then there is no relationship at this point. You could say the relationship is paused. If you have a triad, you have 3 relationships, and you can see it gets exponentially complex with every person that you add. In a group of 4, you have 6 relationships. So let's say A and B, this is mom and dad. They've got 2 kids. You have mom's relationship with both kids, right? Both collectively and individually. Then you have dad's relationship with both kids, collectively and independently. So if mom takes the kids on a short road trip to see grandmother, while they're in the car, mom can talk to both of them, or she can talk to one or the other. And that is, those are all different dynamics. This is just interesting when you think about it, because if you fast forward to a group of 7, there are 21 relationships. And over the years, I've enjoyed asking my students about their family size. And the reason why I think this is interesting is because uh, the idea that your family is different because of the number of people in it doesn't really occur to us. It's always there, but we don't think about it. If you were to add one additional sibling, how would that have affected your life? If we could have removed one sibling, how would that have affected dynamics? Obviously, not something that we want to think about. But we can talk about what happens when somebody moves away. So you probably have had siblings, possibly have had siblings who moved away. Maybe one of your parents, maybe there was a divorce, one of your parents married someone different who had kids, and then all of a sudden it's like the Brady Bunch, complex, and the complexities are oftentimes largely just because of the number of people. What's interesting about a larger group, if you look at the group of 7, 21 different relationships. Let's say that G, E, and C are female. F and D are male. Mom's A, dad is B. So perhaps the dad has a side business of mowing lawns and does this on the weekends, and he takes F and D. Well, that's one subgroup. Now, when dad gives the boys a job and they're alone, well, that's one group. And these F and D are probably going to get pretty close. Same thing for G, E, and C, the females. Could be that G is the oldest, therefore E and C are a little closer. But because C is, let's just say, she's the baby of the family, G comes home from college and enjoys spending time with C. Well, by the time C is grown up and ready to go to, let's say she's a senior in high school, she may feel like an only child because the rest are gone. And family dynamics can always change, but there should be a stability to them that produces a sense of consistency. So in terms of leadership styles, we have different types of leaders. You have instrumental and expressive leaders. Instrumental leaders are those who keep the group going toward meeting of its goals, and these are sometimes referred to as a intellectual leader, whereas the expressive leader is tied to the group's morale. This is oftentimes a person that's using motivation and kind of checking in with the emotional state of the group. And you have the greatest leaders, I think, who can do both. These are very effective. Now, of different types, you have the authoritarian leaders, which give instruction with no information. This is the John Wayne parent. Do as I say, not as I do. Do it because I said so. Democratic leaders trying to gain a group consensus. So the authoritarian leader tells the child, you're going to paint your room, right, this color. The democratic says you have these 3 colors to paint the room. And the laissez-faire parent says, tell us what color to buy, we'll buy it, and you paint it. So the leadership style can change as the situation changes, and I think the greatest leaders are those who know when to do the authoritarian style, when to do the democratic style, and when to do the laissez-faire style. So some important cases here in sociology. Solomon Asch study is very famous out of social psychology. He studied the effects of peer pressure. He used a set of cards, and he told the participant that this was a study in the measure of line length. But as he told this participant, there were also 6, call them stooges, or you could call them actors, but they were in on the research experiment. Only one person was being studied, and all of the other actors were told to give the wrong answer. And so the study was an exploration or examination of conformity. How likely are we as people to do something that we know is not right because a group influences us. I think at the basis of this study, it shows us that we are far more conforming than we would like to admit. And a similar study comes from Stanley Milgram. He studied the effects of authority figures. Now here, this is also using deception in the teacher-learner experiment. The learner was a person who volunteered for the research, and the teacher Milgram informed the learner that a teacher, okay, let me start over. All right, the teacher-learner experiment was one in which the volunteer for the study was identified as the teacher, and he was to teach someone identified as the learner. The learner was also a counterfeit. He was a person who was playing along. The idea here, as told to the teacher, was you will look through this one-way mirror. The learner can't see you. You're going to give a list of vocabulary words, and when the learner makes a mistake, you're going to administer electric shock by pressing this button. The teacher obviously was not comfortable with this. This was a volunteer for research. He wanted to help people, did not want to hurt people. But he was told very explicitly that this was for the greater good. You can't drop out. He was coerced to continue. This was really before the days of a lot of ethics in research. Today we would see this as highly unethical to lie to research subjects. And the teacher was deceived because the learner was an actor. Yet through the course of the research study, the learner would intentionally get some wrong, and when the button was pressed, he would pretend to admit to be shocked. And the study was not measuring the effect of learning and recall on when a person is stressed, so the effect of stress on recall. The study was actually studying the effect of conformity. How likely are you to do something you know is not right if someone in authority coerces you? This also holds this idea that we are far more susceptible to conformity than we think. So I look forward to hearing what you have to say as we see a picture here from the Solomon Asch experiment, the examination of line length, and I'll be interested to find out from you, how likely would you be to hold to your guns and to say something that you know is right, and to say it, even if everyone else doesn't. You can see here that card 1 was the line length. Simply had to identify the closest line, and if you had 5 or 6 people in a room who were saying B, they're all saying B, research shows that you would be more inclined to go along, even if you know it's not right. So look forward to hearing what you have to say, finding out if there are ever experiences when you have gone along with the group, even against your better judgment. All right, thanks.